Hotep, everybody. Hey, this is Michael Imhotep. We're back for part 2 of the African History Network show. Had problems with Zoom, so we're back for part 2. How's everybody doing? And trying this out here with the okay. So I'm using the what's this? The Halo Light Pro unit, the light and the stand. So hopefully you all can hear me okay. Broadcasting from the phone. All right, let's continue here. All right, let's continue here. So I was dealing with the article from, let's check this lighting here, see if that'll work. Okay, here we go. I was dealing with this article from NBCnews.com from Juneteenth to the Tulsa Massacre. From Juneteenth to the Tulsa Massacre, what isn't taught in classrooms has a profound impact. From Juneteenth to the Tulsa Massacre, what isn't taught in classrooms has a profound impact. And this is an article dealing with what happens when the history of African Americans especially is not taught in schools across the country. Okay. All right, so everybody share this broadcast on your social media platforms. We just finished interviewing Professor James Small. We'll have that full interview available soon, and you can watch that at the African History Network on Facebook, and Michael Imhotep on YouTube, IMHOTEP. All right, and let me see if I can adjust this here. This is my first time using this stand here with the cell phone, so I'm trying to get used to it. All right, so hopefully y'all can hear me okay. All right, so this article deals with, it talks about some examples of bad information being taught dealing with the history of African Americans in schools. Okay, bad information being taught dealing with the history of African Americans in schools, and it gives some examples. Connecticut 4th grader social studies textbook falsely claimed that slaves were taught that slaves were treated just like family. This was a textbook in Connecticut. A Texas geography textbook referred to enslaved Africans as workers. And in Alabama, up until the 1970s, 4th graders learned in a textbook called Know Alabama, K-N-O-W, Know Alabama, that slave life on a plantation was, quote, one of the happiest ways of life. Slave life on a plantation was, quote, one of the happiest ways of life, end quote. Well, happy for who? Happy for the slave owner who was benefiting from the at least 262 skills, trades, and crafts that African people had in this country from 1619 to 1865. Wasn't happy in general for enslaved Africans, especially on plantations. Okay, so happy for who? So, in contrast, historians and educators point out many children in the U.S. education system are not taught about major black historical events such as the Tulsa Race Massacre or Juneteenth as well. And a lot of people just found out about Juneteenth this past year for a number of reasons. And just so people understand, African Americans were celebrating Juneteenth before Donald Trump found out about it. Okay, I want people to know that. And then also, we have been celebrating Juneteenth in various forms for 155 years, going back to basically 1865, 1866. Okay, just so people understand. All right, so historians said curriculums are about identity and learning about ourselves and others. Okay, Julian Hayter, H-A-Y-T-E-R, is a historian and an associate professor at the University of Richmond in Virginia. And Julian said, quote, "The curriculum was never designed to be anything other than white supremacists. The curriculum was never designed to be anything other than white supremacists." And it has been very difficult to convince people that other versions of history are not only worth telling, other versions of history are not only worth telling. They're absolutely essential for us as a country to move closer to something that might reflect reconciliation, but even more importantly, the truth. So oftentimes when you deal, for instance, oftentimes when we deal with the history of slavery, it's not told from the perspective of those enslaved. It's told from the perspective of the enslaved. And this is one of the things that this study here, you've heard me talk about it before, from the Southern Poverty Law Center talks about, teaching hard history, American slavery, teaching hard history, American slavery. We talked about it last week with Professor James Small, with Dr. Linda Jeffries last week. One of his nephews, Dr. Hassan Kwame Jeffries, is on the advisory board that put together this, helped put together this study, okay? You can download this from splcenter.org, the Southern Poverty Law Center website, splcenter.org. It's called Teaching Hard History, American Slavery. It's a about 52-page study that documents how the history of slavery is being mistaught in this country. It documents ways it's being mistaught, and then it gives a lot of really good suggestions how to more correctly teach the history of slavery. One of the things they tell you don't do is don't do slave reenactments in classrooms, things like that. Don't do slave reenactments. They talk about how psychologically damaging it can be to children, okay? And every month or every other month, you hear about people doing in schools doing slave reenactments, or you hear about slave lessons gone wrong, slavery lessons gone wrong in schools. They had a board game dealing with running away, all types of nonsense. That, you know, that level of ignorance or insensitivity we don't see usually projected, or that usually doesn't come into play when it deals with other people's history. Okay, so now LeGarrette King is an associate professor of social studies education at the University of Missouri. And LeGarrette King said the history curriculums in schools are meant to tell a story. And in the U.S., that has been one of a progressive history of the country, LeGarrette King said, quote, really the overachieving theme is, yes, we made mistakes, but we overcame because we are the United States of America. Now, LeGarrette King is also the founding director of the Carter Center for K-12 Black History Education at the university as well. LeGarrette King went on to say, what that has done is it has erased tons of history that would combat that progressive narrative, okay? And this is something that Dr. James Loewen talked about. Dr. James Loewen wrote the book, Lies My Teacher Told Me. He was interviewed on News One Now with Roland Martin, probably about 2016, I think it was. And Dr. Greg Carr was in that segment as well. It's on YouTube. And they were talking about Confederate monuments and all different types of things like that. And this is something that the Teaching Hard History of American Slavery documents as well. We only like to talk about the good parts of the history, or when we talk about slavery, oftentimes we like to talk about, well, hey, that was in the past and things got better, etc., but not deal with the real history of enslavement. One of the things that the study talked about is that we like to skip over the origins of slavery in this country and get to Harriet Tubman, get to abolitionists, get to the Underground Railroad, get to Frederick Douglass, things like that, and we're not dealing with the chronology of history and the chronology of slavery in this country. So LeGarrette King said the experiences and oppression of Black people, Latino people, Indigenous people, Asian people, and other minority groups in the U.S. are largely ignored or sidelined to fit those narratives. So when we look at the attack on Tulsa, Oklahoma, for instance, quote, so of course you're not going to have crucial information such as what happened in Tulsa. You're not going to have information such as the bombing of a Philadelphia black neighborhood, the Move bombing in 1985 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Now, in 1921 in Oklahoma, we know that it was about 15. So this article from NBC News says, whites looted and destroyed Tulsa's Greenwood District, known for its affluent black community. You have 15,000 white people that invaded the morning of June 1st, 1921. Okay, they're going to destroy about 1,200 homes. They do businesses, destroy businesses. But we rebuild Black Wall Street with our own dollars. Okay, this is something that's not talked about a lot. And if you read the book by Hannibal B. Johnson dealing with Black Wall Street, this book here, Black Wall Street from Riot to Renaissance in Tulsa's Historic Greenwood District by Hannibal B. Johnson. This is probably one of the best books dealing with the history of Black Wall Street. Okay, I've read it. It's one of my sources for my lecture dealing with the history of Black Wall Street. We have those, and as well as Juneteenth. We talked about this last week. These are available at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. It's a 2.5-hour lecture I did dealing with the origins of Tulsa and the history of Black Wall Street, things like that. Black Wall Street from destruction to the resurrection of economic empowerment. And then my 3-hour lecture dealing with the history of Juneteenth and why Juneteenth is Emancipation Day, not Independence Day. And I deal with the Emancipation Proclamation, why it did not free the enslaved Africans. We deal with the 13th Amendment. General Order Number 3, we deal with 40 Acres and a Mule, Special Field Order Number 15, Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign. We're coming to get our check. Okay, so these are both available at AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. All right, let's continue here. So, when they talk about the attack on Tulsa, Oklahoma, north of Tulsa, the Greenwood District, historians believe that as many as 300 African Americans were killed. Now, that 300 number is believed to be an undercount. That's the number coming from the Red Cross, because the Red Cross sets up a makeshift hospital in Booker T. Washington High School. And the Red Cross is tending to those who were injured and things like this, okay? But it's believed that it could be 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 African Americans who were actually killed. We don't know the exact numbers because there were reports. So, because what happened was some of the African Americans who were injured they escaped to surrounding towns and die there. There are also reports of seeing people dumping black bodies into the river. So we don't know the exact number that were killed. Now, in May 1985, Philadelphia police dropped a bomb on the compound of Move, M-O-V-E, a black liberation group. They killed 6 members, 5 of their children, and destroying 65 homes in the neighborhood. Okay, this is in 1985. Another often omitted period of U.S. history, of U.S. black history, is the Red Summer of 1919. Now, you've heard me talk about the Red Summer numerous times. And in 2019, a lot of people first found out about the Red Summer, okay? And the Red Summer was after World War I ended. World War I is 1914 and 1918. And what's going to happen is when you have about 5 million men who fight in U.S. soldiers who fight in World War I, okay? And most of them white men. You have about 350, 360,000 African Americans, somewhere around there, about 380,000. But when these white men left to go fight in the war, they had jobs. Okay, they had jobs when they were here at home. When they come back, those jobs are being filled largely by African Americans who migrate from the South up north, and they're also being filled by immigrants who were here as well. And this leads to racial explosions in the next year, the year 1919. You have 25 major race riots all across the country. It was James Weldon Johnson, who wrote the lyrics to what later became known as the Black National Anthem, Lift Every Voice. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmony of liberty. That was James Weldon Johnson, who wrote that in 1899. And James Weldon Johnson is also going to organize the Silent March in 1917, calling for federal anti-lynching laws. And he organized a march of 10,000 African Americans marching down Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. This was after the East St. Louis, Illinois race riot in 1917. Okay, and James Weldon Johnson was one of the early members of the NAACP as well. But he's going to organize that march along with the NAACP in 1917. But another often omitted period of U.S. history, U.S. black history, is the Red Summer of 1919, a period of time through 1919 when white mobs incited a wave of anti-black violence in dozens of cities. This is basically at the same time that you have the Spanish flu pandemic going on from 1918 to 1919. It's that same period of time that this is taking place. So in 2019, that was the 100th year anniversary of the Red Summer, okay? And a lot of people were finding out about this for the first time. And I did a lecture in 2019. My African American History Month lecture was partly dealing with the Red Summer, okay? We dealt with the Red Summer and the 400th year anniversary of 1619, and how we dealt with some of the history of African people here long before 1619. We've been here for thousands of years. If you read the book, The First Americans Were Africans, Documented Evidence by Dr. David Imhotep, this book right here, The First Americans Were Africans, Documented Evidence by Dr. David Imhotep. This book deals with the African presence in specifically the land we call the United States of America, going back at least 51,700 years ago. The Khoisan, who come from Southern Africa, have the oldest DNA on the planet. They're the ancestors to the Ainu and the Twa. They go all around the world, and they were here. Okay, this is why I tell people, some African Americans say we should go back to Africa, and I mean, I can understand that. Or they say we should separate. African Americans say we should separate. And I say, one, why should we be the ones who leave? Because this was our land stolen from us. Two, if white people want to go back to where they came from, okay, that's fine, that's understandable. But this was our land stolen from us. African people were here before Native Americans even came to this land. And that's not against our Native American brothers and sisters. But why should we be the ones that leave? Last hide, first fire. Why should we be the ones that leave? Even when we talk about African Americans who have African slave ancestry here, many of our ancestors who were enslaved Africans, many of our ancestors were here before a lot of European immigrants came to this land. So this is not attacking anybody for their ancestry or ethnicity or anything like that. This is dealing with the history. Okay? So as for the protests against racial inequality and police brutality after the killing of George Floyd and other African Americans at the hands of police, LaGarrett King emphasized that these movements were not new. These movements were not new. Okay? Also, if you like this type of information, I forgot to say, you can donate to the African History Network, $ TheAHNShow through Cash App, $ TheAHNShow through Cash App, and on our YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep, IMHOTEP. I'm sorry, Cash App, and then PayPal, paypal.me/TheAHNShow, paypal.me/TheAHNShow, or at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. Click on the yellow donate button. Okay, that helps us keep doing the research, find out our Sunday night show, the African History Network show, etc. Okay, so as for the protests against racial inequality and police brutality after the killing of George Floyd and others, Ahmaud Arbery, we have Breonna Taylor, etc. The list goes on. African Americans at the hands of police, LaGarrett King emphasized that these movements were not new. Quote, black people have been saying this for the past 400 years. This is not a new movement. He said, quote, each generation has had their point in time where they're trying to say through protest, through rebellion, quote, listen to us, end quote. When you look at the race riot in 1919, I think it was July 1919 in Chicago, part of that stems from African Americans fighting police after a 17-year-old African American teenager named Eugene Williams, I think it was Eugene Williams, he was stoned to death in the river. He was swimming in the river, and he crossed the imaginary line that separated the white side of the beach from the black side of the beach. And he gets stoned to death. The police are called. African Americans point out to the police who were throwing the stones at him. The police ignore that and start arresting some African Americans for like other reasons, what have you. And we start fighting the police there, okay, at the beach. And this is going to explode into the Chicago race riot in 1919. You've heard me talk about this before. Now, part of the article from NBC News goes on to say, part of the problem is that society has never listened to that history. Okay, that history that is counter to the dominant narrative. That history that brings in the experience of other people who are not writing the history. Okay, each generation has had their point in time where they're trying to say through protest, through rebellion, listen to us, listen to us. Quote, in many ways, we would not have a Black Lives Matter movement if Black Lives mattered in the classroom, LaGarrett King said. In many ways, we would not have a Black Lives Matter movement if Black lives did not matter in the classroom, or if Black lives mattered in the classroom, I should say. Now, the current moment has also put increased national attention on the celebration of Juneteenth, June 19th. And as I said before, now African Americans have been celebrating Juneteenth for 155 years. Now, some people just found out about Juneteenth in the past, few weeks. I don't know what to tell you. Okay, but we've been celebrating that in various ways to various levels in different parts of the country for 155 years. Okay, now some in northern states over the past 10, maybe 15 years or so started celebrating it more so. It died out. It died down at certain periods of time and it rejuvenated in other periods of time. But just so people understand, we were celebrating this long before Donald Trump found out about it. Okay. Now, Donald Trump said in an interview with the Wall Street Journal that he moved the rally in Tulsa set for Friday to Saturday out of respect for two African American friends and supporters, two TWO. Okay. He said, quote, I did something good. I made it famous. I made Juneteenth very famous. Juneteenth was famous before Donald Trump started talking about Juneteenth. Just like Frederick Douglass was famous before Donald Trump started talking about it. Just like, Justin Timberlake said he brought sexy back. I ain't know sexy went somewhere, but okay, whatever. It's interesting how you have some white people that just want to claim stuff that existed before them. It's like Columbusing, or the term, the phrase "colonizers be colonized." And it's like, hold on, all this stuff existed before you stumbled upon it. It's actually an important event. It's an important time. This is what Donald Trump said, but nobody had heard of it. Okay, now Donald Trump is projecting. He's talking about he really didn't know about Juneteenth, even though he's done addresses and made statements in the past about Juneteenth. It was probably written by somebody else and they gave it to him. Okay, just like when he talks about Black History Month every February. Okay. Now, historians note that Juneteenth has been celebrated in black communities across the country for 155 years. Yeah, it has been. Now, Julian Hayter, Hayter, said that the history of black people, African Americans, and other minority groups has already, quote, been completely whitewashed and erased, end quote, when it is taught in American classrooms. He pointed to the argument made by some that removing Confederate statues and iconography is tantamount to erasing history. Now, I would ask the question, whose history are you talking about? Because the Confederacy, these were the traitors to the Union. And it's interesting how Donald Trump, on the one hand, says support the troops. And he talks about how he loves the U.S. military and things like this, right? On the other hand, he talks about preserving Confederate monuments. Well, the Confederacy committed treason based upon Article 3, Section 3 of the U.S. Constitution. Now, Donald Trump has never read the U.S. Constitution. Okay? He's clueless of it. But the Confederacy, General Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, and PGT Beauregard and Stonewall Jackson, all of them, they took up arms against the Union and fought against the Union to maintain slavery, and they killed U.S. soldiers of the same military that Donald Trump says we should love and we want to support. So how does Trump support the Confederacy when they killed U.S. soldiers? These were traitors to the Union. Then you look at the article from the New York Times, the bombshell article from Friday, June 26, 2020. Russia secretly offered Afghan militants bounties to kill U.S. troops, intelligence says. American intelligence officials have concluded that a Russian military intelligence unit secretly offered bounties to Taliban-linked militants for killing coalition forces in Afghanistan, including targeting American troops, and the peace talks to end the long-running war there, according to officials briefed amid the peace talks to end the long-running war there, according to officials briefed on the matter. The United States concluded, the intelligence community concluded months ago, that the Russian unit, which has been linked to assassination attempts and other covert operations in Europe intended to destabilize the West or take revenge on turncoats, had covertly offered rewards for successful attacks in 2019. Islamist militants or armed criminal elements closely associated with them are believed to have collected some bounty money, the official said. 21 Americans were killed in combat in Afghanistan in 2019, but it was not clear which killings were under suspicion at the time of the reporting from the New York Times. The intelligence finding was briefed to Donald Trump, and the White House's National Security Council discussed the problem at an interagency meeting in late March 2020, the officials said. Officials developed a menu of potential options, starting with making a diplomatic complaint to Moscow and a demand that it stop, along with an escalating series of sanctions and other possible responses. But the White House, led by Donald Trump, okay, the Manchurian candidate, the traitor-in-chief, but the White House has yet to authorize any step, the official said. An operation to incentivize the killing of American and other NATO troops would be a significant and provocative escalation of what American and Afghan officials have said is Russian support for the Taliban. And it would be the first time that the Russian spy unit was known to have orchestrated attacks on Western troops. Now, Donald Trump has come out since then and said, we look at the reporting from, let's look at the Associated Press. And we posted all these articles on our Facebook fan page, the African History Network. Trump denies briefing on reported bounties against U.S. troops. Trump denies briefing on reported bounties against U.S. troops. Donald Trump, this is the Associated Press reporting this. Donald Trump on Sunday, June 28, 2020, denied that he was made aware of U.S. intelligence officials' conclusions that Russia secretly offered bounties to Taliban-linked militants for killing American troops in Afghanistan. The Trump administration was set to brief select members of Congress on the matter on Monday, June 29th. The intelligence assessments came amid Trump's push to withdraw the U.S. from Afghanistan and suggested that Russia was making overtures to militants as the U.S. and the Taliban were holding talks to end a long-running war. The assessment was first reported by the New York Times and then confirmed to the Associated Press by American intelligence officials and 2 others with knowledge of the matter. Now, NBC News has since also confirmed the reporting by the New York Times. So when we now Donald Trump, now the White House and Trump largely in general are not denying the conclusion from the intelligence community. They're largely saying Trump wasn't briefed on this. And Malcolm Nance, when he was interviewed June 28, 2020 on AM Joy, Malcolm Nance broke down how somebody's lying. Now, there were conflicting reports about whether Trump was aware of Russia's actions. The intelligence officials said the intelligence officials told the Associated Press that the president was briefed on the matter earlier this year, earlier 2020. Trump denied that, tweeting on Sunday that neither he nor Vice President Mike Pence had been briefed. The president tweeted Sunday night that he was just told that intelligence officials did not report the information to him because they didn't find it credible. Now, New York Times disputes this. The intelligence officials and others with knowledge of the matter who spoke to the Associated Press insisted on anonymity in order to discuss the highly sensitive matter. The White House National Security Council would not confirm the assessments, but said the U.S. receives thousands of intelligence reports daily that are subject to strict scrutiny. Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican of South Carolina, one of Trump's flunkies, and he golfed with Donald Trump on Sunday, June 28th. He tweeted a day earlier that it is, quote, imperative Congress get to the bottom of recent media reports that Russian GRU units in Afghanistan have offered to pay the Taliban to kill American soldiers with the goal of pushing America out of the region, end quote. Now, it's interesting that you have these Republicans, Lindsey Graham, who chairs the Senate Intelligence Committee. He lacks intelligence and he doesn't have a spine. His spine is buried in John McCain's coffin, Lindsey Graham. But you're going to hear in subsequent days more Republican senators come out and grandstand and talk about how this is horrible, needs to be investigated, things like this. Yeah, but you know, you had the power to remove Trump from office February 2020 in the Senate impeachment trial, and you lacked the testicular fortitude to do that. So whatever blowback, whatever price Trump has to pay, whatever consequences are going to be from this investigation and fallout, then a lot of these Republican senators who were too cowardly to remove Trump from office, they deserve some of the blame also. Everybody from Susan Collins to Lisa Murkowski to Lamar Alexander to Senator Ted Cruz, all these traitors, all these Republican senators who were traitors, who stood on the Senate floor and said how that the shakedown of Vladimir Zelensky in that July 25th, 2019 call that Trump made with the new Ukrainian president Vladimir Zelensky. They said what Trump did was wrong, but it did not rise to the level of removing him from office. They said, a lot of them intimated or said the various ways he's learned his lesson, he ain't gonna do that again. Really? Does this rise to the level of removing his ass from office? Now, you had all the evidence in front of you then. He was not fit to be president, and he should have been removed from office. But you were too cowardly to do that. You lacked the testicular fortitude. So whatever consequences he pays, you should pay also. This is why I've been telling you for months. Every last one of these traitors, these Republican senators who violated their oath to office, they take an oath to defend the Constitution against enemies, both foreign and domestic. You have an enemy of the Constitution in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue right now. And day after day, his actions get worse. So he's defending monuments to traitors to the Constitution, right? And at the same time, something like this is taking place. Okay. Elections have consequences. This is why I explained to people 2016. So now I feel sorry for anybody that has relatives in the military and you're dealing with a traitor like this in the White House. But all the evidence was there. I warned people. I warned our people in 2016 about this trade. People ain't want to listen to me. They we don't need to vote. We just need to invest in the stock market and do economic empowerment. Okay, I said that's good. We need to do that, and we need to vote and stop this person. Because politics is the legal distribution of scarce wealth, power, and resources. Politics is the writing of laws, statutes, ordinances, amendments, and treaties, their adoption, interpretation, and enforcement. And laws and policies impact the economic environment that your business operates within. So because of his dereliction of duty, not reading his presidential daily briefings, because there were warnings about coronavirus going back to November and December 2019 in his presidential daily briefings, but this dumbass doesn't read them. We're at 127,000 deaths in this country, 2.5 million cases. It's expected that almost half of African American businesses are not going to survive this coronavirus economy. Most of this stuff was avoidable if you had competent leadership. If you had somebody competent in the White House who has not declared war on scientists for the past 3 years, okay, who does not think that he knows more than the scientists and the generals. If you had competent leadership, the majority of this stuff was avoidable. And if we had studied the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, we would have seen this coming. Because when I've done a whole broadcast with, I think it was March, either March or April. Go back and watch that on Facebook, the African History Network, and my YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep. Because during the Spanish flu pandemic, right here in the U.S., it killed 675,000 Americans. 50 million people worldwide died from it. It hit in 3 main waves. The second wave was worse than the first wave. We haven't even gotten through the first wave of coronavirus here, and it's resurging, as we talked about on the show today. First part of the show. What's the point of studying history if you're going to make the same stupid ass mistakes? Because during the Spanish flu pandemic, they practiced social distancing. They wore face masks, surgical masks. They closed schools, closed churches, canceled events, canceled sporting events, shut down businesses, all that stuff that's going on today. That happened in 1918 and 1919. So the chickens are coming home to roost. The chickens are coming home to roost. Read the reporting from the Associated Press. We posted an article on our Facebook fan page, the African History Network. Read the article from NPR.org, PBS NewsHour. Trump denies briefing on reported bounties against U.S. troops. And you're going to hear more about this in subsequent days. They're not going to be able to run from this. They're not going to be able to hide. So we go back to the article from NBC News. Now all this is connected. Trump preserving. So at the same time that Trump is saying they're going to stop funding testing centers for coronavirus, including states that are hard hit by coronavirus. You're going to stop funding tests, but you're going to preserve Confederate monuments to traitors. He signed an executive order to preserve Confederate monuments to traitors, and you're going to stop funding testing for coronavirus, and at the same time you trying to take away the Affordable Health Care Act. You have your Department of Justice in court trying to take away the Affordable Health Care Act and take away health care from 20 million people during a global pandemic. And you thought this was about Hillary versus Trump? I told you, I told our people in 2016, a presidential election is never about one person versus another person. This is about the trajectory of the country for the next 20, 30 years. This is about Supreme Court justices, federal court judges. Trump just got his 200th federal court judge confirmed. These are lifetime appointments. They're and he's getting the list of the federal judges largely from the Federalist Foundation and the Heritage Society, two right-wing conservative organizations that focus on pushing right-wing ideology through law. Through law. Let's go back to this article because I got to get out of here. From Juneteenth to the Tulsa Massacre, what isn't taught in classrooms has a profound impact. You're right about that, because we don't understand politics. Politics is the legal distribution of scarce wealth, power, and resources, and the writing of laws, statutes, ordinances, amendments, and treaties that adopt interpretation and enforcement. So when I deal with principles of political self-defense, part of political self-defense deals with not just understanding law, but understanding history, so you see these trends coming, so you know how to protect yourself against this. Because if we understood Richard Nixon in 1968, who ran on the platform of law and order and won in 1968, as a backlash to the Black Power movement, the Civil Rights movement, the rebellions taking place all across the country. If we understood Nixon, we would have seen Trump coming and we would have stopped him. Because if you understand patterns in history, you can see trends taking place, so you know how to learn from the mistakes and not make the same mistakes again. If we understood Nixon in 68, we would have stopped Trump in 2016. Because Trump was a backlash to two terms of President Barack Obama. He was a backlash to the Black Lives Matter movement. He was a backlash to efforts to the protests that were taking place then. He was a backlash to things like the effort to hold police accountable, etc. He ran on the platform of law and order. He said police don't need to have less power, they need to have more power. He said he wants to be the law and order president. Law and order is a dog whistle that goes back to Nixon. Law and order means protect white people and lock up African Americans. That's what law and order means. So Julian Hayter, Hayter, pointed to the argument made by some that removing Confederate statues and iconography is tantamount to erasing history. Quote, so when people say you can't erase history, it's like, what are you talking about, he said. If you crack open a textbook from the mid-20th century, mid-1900s, 1950s, right? There are no minorities in the textbooks. The contributions they made to the American democratic experience are completely ignored, he said. He said those histories have been seen as, quote, footage to a larger narrative and not an important and integral portion of the history more largely. He said, quote, as long as we continue to treat these as addendums to a larger American narrative, we're failing these kids, in large part because we've reduced these histories to second-class status, end quote. We've reduced these histories to second-class status. And this is why with the study Teaching Hard History of American Slavery from the Southern Poverty Law Center, one of the recommendations they make to better teach and better understand the history of slavery is to read slave narratives, to understand slavery and teach that history from the perspective of the enslaved as opposed to the slave owners. Now, they go on to say, they cite the historian Hagopian. Let me get the first name. Let's see here. We got Garrett King, and who else did they cite? I forgot Hagopian's first name, but Hagopian went on to say, teaching for Black Lives seeks to uncover some of these really important periods of Black history and give educators access points to teach students about them, including a whole lesson on the Tulsa Race Massacre, okay? So teaching Black Lives is a curriculum. Let me go back to that here just a second here. teaching Black Lives. Let me see if I can find that reference. Okay, but they have it here in the article somewhere. I can't find it. So he said another historical period that was glaringly absent from the mainstream curriculum was Reconstruction. So Reconstruction area following the Civil War that sought to address the inequalities of slavery. Reconstruction is 1865 to 1877. Okay, the Reconstruction era. Very, very important period of history. And then what brings about the end of Reconstruction is the compromise of 1877 between the Republicans and the Democrats. And in that presidential election, neither the Republican or the Democratic candidate had enough electoral college votes to become president. So Republicans make a compromise with the Democrats to remove the Union troops out of the South that were to a large extent protecting the rights of newly freed slaves, former slaves, the black freedmen, in exchange for Rutherford B. Hayes becoming president, the Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes. This is the compromise of 1877, and this ends Reconstruction, ushers in a new era of Jim Crow, and is going to lead to, subsequently, you're going to have the U.S. Supreme Court case 1895 of Plessy versus Ferguson, which legalizes separate but equal, legalizes the Jim Crow laws. And this is reversing the progress that a lot of African Americans were making during Reconstruction. Henry Louis Gates Jr. has I think it's a three-part, either 3 or 4-part series on PBS, and you can go to pbs.org and watch it during Reconstruction. And I've had my criticisms of Gates, but he does do some good research. There's some legitimate criticisms of him and some of his take on the involvement of Africans in the transatlantic slave trade. If you read the article from Dr. Milefikete Asante, Henry Louis Gates is wrong about African involvement in the slave trade. This breaks this down. That's at asante.net, A-S-A-N-T-E, asante.net, Dr. Milefikete Asante. So Reconstruction is one of the most fascinating and revolutionary periods in American history, Hagopian said. It was a remarkable period of time, although short, when the country undertook a conscious effort to tear down institutionally racist structures. And we need to really study Reconstruction, because to be honest with you, as 14% of the population, I don't think we're going to get reparations, especially the way we're going about it, because these aren't even legal arguments that are being made for reparations. We're arguing morality. We're not arguing law. Because if we were arguing law, we would talk about Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1 of the U.S. Constitution that laid the foundation for March 2nd, 1807, the U.S. Congress outlawing the international transatlantic slave trade. Because Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1 of the U.S. Constitution dealt with, at the Philadelphia Convention in 1787, the 13 colonies are debating abolishing the international transatlantic slave trade. And that's the importation of Africans into this country. That's not abolishing slavery within the U.S. in the auctions and things like this. That's abolishing, bringing Africans into this country. And you have 5 states that abolished slavery by 1787, starting with Vermont, July 2nd, 1777. And you can have Massachusetts and Connecticut, things like this. They either have abolished slavery altogether, or they abolished bringing Africans into the country. And at one point, South Carolina had abolished it, but they brought it back. So all 13 colonies had agreed to abolish the importation of Africans into this country, except South Carolina. This is in 1787 at the Philadelphia Convention, where they're drafting and debating the U.S. Constitution. So they decided to table that argument for at least 20 years. And that's Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1 of the U.S. Constitution. We should read it. Anytime we debate law, we need to understand the U.S. Constitution, because the U.S. Constitution, the 7 articles and 27 amendments, are the foundation of law in this country. You go to loc.gov, the Library of Congress website, or archives.gov, the National Archives, and read the U.S. Constitution. Okay? So, it's passed by Congress March 2nd, 1807, and History.com is an article dealing with that. U.S. Congress abolishes international transatlantic slave trade March 2nd, 1807. And then it goes into effect January 1st, 1808. Therefore, all of the Africans brought in this country from January 1st, 1808 to June 1860, when the Clotilda comes into Alabama, that was all illegal. That was all human trafficking. That was all illegal based upon the U.S. own laws. They had naval ships out on the waterways looking for contraband, looking for slave ships coming into this country because it was illegal. But instead of us taking a legal argument for reparations, we take a moral argument. And as I explain to people, you don't go to lawmakers arguing morality. You go to lawmakers arguing law. Well, okay. That's another conversation that I don't have time for right now. Quote, black people built the public school system across the South, and there were integrated schools in the 1860s. They were more integrated than today. Just incredible examples of black empowerment, end quote, Hagopian said, adding that there were more black elected officials than any time until recently. Okay, so 1860s, you're dealing with during Reconstruction, right? The Reconstruction era is a very fascinating period of time, Reconstruction. You're going to have African American senators and a number of members, like 2 U.S. senators, 20 members of U.S. Congress, African American members of U.S. Congress. And when you watch the movie Birth of a Nation, the original Birth of a Nation, which debuts February 8th, 1915. In 1915 is the 50th year anniversary of the Civil War ending, the 13th Amendment, and slaves illegally being freed, etc. But also December 24th, 1865 is when the Ku Klux Klan was founded in Pulaski, Tennessee. They started as a fraternal order because they were a fraternal brotherhood, the Ku Klux Klan, and they developed into this domestic terrorist organization. History.com has a good article dealing with the Ku Klux Klan and their history and their origins, things like this. So when you watch the movie The Birth of a Nation, it's on YouTube, directed by D.W. Griffith. It takes place during slavery, Civil War, and Reconstruction. And the movie basically rejuvenates the Ku Klux Klan, and it shows the Klan as being heroes. Because at the end of the movie, it shows the Ku Klux Klan putting down a rebellion of former Union Negro soldiers. And the movie takes place in South Carolina. And it shows Dr. Clarion, I think was his name. He was a doctor, and he was a slave owner. And the movie, all the negative stereotypical images of African Americans are depicted in this film. The mammies and the bucks and the pickaninnies and things like this. All the negative stereotypical images of African Americans are depicted in this film. The film calls Race Riots in the Streets, and also show black men trying to rape white women, specifically rape white women who were virgins. This is all in the movie. The movie calls Race Riots in the Street. Now, we had sense enough to lead protests against the movie. Okay, the NAACP led protests against the movie. People like William Monroe Trotter. We led protests because we knew that movie was detrimental to our existence for a number of reasons. And President Woodrow Wilson had a private screening of the film at the White House. Woodrow Wilson was a big white supremacist. So Hagopian goes on to say, it's such an important era to examine, Reconstruction. If we're going to escape the intense level of racism that we have today, we're going to need to look at what it looked like when there was a movement toward institutional anti-racism during Reconstruction. Now, it's also important to teach students that the civil rights movement went beyond a few famous figures commonly featured in history books or during Black History Month, such as Dr. King and Rosa Parks. Now, both of them owned guns. Rosa Parks' husband, Raymond Parks, owned guns. Dr. King owned guns until Bayard Rustin convinced Dr. King to get rid of his guns. And it's important for people to read this book here. This nonviolent stuff that get you killed. How guns made the civil rights movement possible. Okay? This is by Professor Charles E. Cobb Jr. Professor Charles E. Cobb Jr. He was a member of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and he worked in rural Mississippi for 5 years with for SNCC to register African Americans to vote. And he talks about how they never stayed, you know, the civil rights workers never stayed in someone's house, a black person's house who didn't own a gun, didn't have a gun over the fireplace, something like that. Because he said, you know, you grew up in the South, you grew up in a gun culture. And up until 1915, up until the turn of the century, up until about 1900, 90% of African Americans lived in the South. It's a legacy of slavery. Then we have the Great Migration starting in 1915. 1915 and 1970, 6 million African Americans migrated out of the South, up north and out west. So you grow up in a gun culture. You have a lot of African Americans who were farmers, things like this, and you had to be able to protect your property, your farm. You have animals who are predators trying to kill livestock, etc. So you had to be able to protect yourself. Okay. But they talk about Dr. King. They talk about, you know, the civil rights movement was ostensibly a nonviolent movement. You know, I interviewed Professor James Small. We didn't talk about the civil rights movement. I interviewed him on this today's show. But I've interviewed him in the past. He's talked about that in his past, how the civil rights movement was not a nonviolent movement. On the surface, it was nonviolent, but it was, you had African Americans with guns, and civil rights workers owned guns, and activists, Medgar Evers owned guns, Fannie Lou Hamer owned guns, Rosa Parks' husband, Raymond Parks, owned guns, Dr. King, Fred Shuttlesworth, Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth in Birmingham. So when you get past the facade, it's like the movie Black Panther. There was the facade that Wakanda was a third world country, but it was actually the most technologically advanced country in the world. They gave the projection that they were a poor third world country. They were not. The civil rights movement was not a nonviolent movement. If it had not been for Negroes with guns, there would not have been a civil rights movement. Even before the Deacons for Defense and Justice, founded July 10th, 1964 in Jonesboro, Louisiana. This is probably the preeminent book dealing with the history of the Deacons for Defense and Justice by Lance Hill. The Deacons for Defense, Armed Resistance, and the Civil Rights Movement. There was armed resistance being waged during the Civil Rights Movement, which is not talked about in Eyes on the Prize. This is even though there's some good information in the documentary Eyes on the Prize, is historically flawed. It's grossly flawed. And it's telling, there are truths in it, but it's telling a overall false narrative of the Civil Rights Movement. Just the fact that you only deal with Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam for like 90 seconds, literally about 90 seconds, in the third installment dealing with 1965, it's like, okay, all right. Yeah, Robert F. Williams and the Black Guard in North Carolina. Okay, so but this book right here, this is a deep book. This nonviolent stuff that gets you killed, how guns made the civil rights movement possible, by Professor Charles E. Cobb Jr. So he goes on to say, Hagopian goes on to say, quote, I think one of the most important things for students to learn about is the way young people have helped shape American history in profound ways, and to help understand the contributions, especially of black youth, to this nation, he said. They're so often erased, but when students learn that it was young people who were the leaders of the civil rights movement, they can see themselves as potential actors to transform the world today. They can see themselves as potential actors to transform the world today. Okay, and there's a good article also by from Washington Post that deals with. It's a good article from Washington Post that deals with African Americans and guns and the civil rights movement. I'm going to try to pull up their article. What's the name of that one? There's one dealing with the way of the, was it blacks and guns, or the way of the gun, or something like that. What is that? Let me try to pull this up. Negroes and the gun. This is one good article here. This is from Washington Post. Nonviolent Winchesters and the fine art of concealed carry in the modern civil rights movement. Now, this is written by Professor Nicholas Johnson. Professor Nicholas Johnson. Negroes and the gun, nonviolent Winchesters and the fine art of concealed carry, from Washington Post. Then also there's Professor Charles E. Cobb Jr. wrote an article for the Washington Post as well, and News1.com has an article dealing with him also, and it has the segment that he did on News One Now with Roland Martin. Black and Armed. Author explains how guns made the civil rights movement possible. This is from January 26, 2015. Black and Armed. Author explains how guns made the civil rights movement possible. Okay, this is a deep, rich history that's left out of the larger narrative when we talk about the civil rights movement. Okay, because I mean, you know, just in general, not to, well, maybe I shouldn't say that, but maybe I shouldn't call any names, but the civil rights superstars don't talk about this part of the history. Okay, and when they have the corporate funded Dr. King Day breakfasts and things like that, they don't deal with this part of the history. This is one of the reasons why I don't get invited to speak at a lot of those Dr. King Day celebrations, because what was it, 2015, I spoke at the Charles H. Wright Museum for the Dr. King Day celebration. I did a presentation and I talked about the Deacons for Defense of Justice, and I said the civil rights movement was not a nonviolent movement, and if it had not been for Negroes with guns, it would not have been a civil rights movement. So they ain't asked me to speak again at Dr. King Day celebration. And I told him, I said, I'll debate anybody you have on this. I don't care how many degrees they have. It was not a nonviolent movement. So, you know, but okay. All right, so hey, if you'd like this type of information, you can donate to the African History Network. $ the TheAHNShow through Cash App. $ the TheAHNShow through Cash App. PayPal.me/TheAHNShow through PayPal, or at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. Click on the yellow donate button. All my DVD lectures are there. We have digital downloads. We have my Juneteenth 3-hour lecture dealing with the real history of Juneteenth. Black Wall Street. We have bundle packs. We have my lecture, 6 Principles of Political Self-Defense, Understanding How Laws and Policies Impact the Economic Conditions of African Americans. You can read articles that I write at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. Also, we have a recommended reading list of about 70 books there. So at the top of the page, click on book list. Yes, we have a lot of information for you. Follow me on my Facebook fan page, The African History Network, The African History Network, and turn on notifications so you know when we go live. Also, follow me on my YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep, IMHOTEP. Click on notifications there as well. We'll turn on notifications so you know when we go live there as well. All right. And somebody asked for the names of the books. You got this Nonviolent Stuff That Gets You Killed, How Guns Made the Civil Rights Movement Possible, by Professor Charles E. Cobb Jr. Also, the Deacons for Defense. We know there was the movie on Showtime starring Forrest Whitaker. Really good movie dealing with the history of the Deacons for Defense. They were a precursor to the Black Panther Party for self-defense. Black Panther Party for self-defense was founded October 1966. Deacons for Defense founded in 1964, July, I think it was July 10th, 1964. Jonesboro, Louisiana, by Frederick Douglass and Ernest Thomas Kilpatrick. And they're going to do security for Dr. King many times, as well as CORE, Congress of Racial Equality. Okay. So these two books, and then the other one here that is mentioned in the New York Times article is the other one deals with Negroes and the Gun by Professor Nicholas Johnson. Professor Nicholas Johnson wrote this article. He said the longest chapter in the book Negroes and the Gun is devoted to the modern civil rights movement. The record here is rich with oral histories, memoirs, and other detailed first-hand accounts that illuminated the black tradition of guns, illuminated the black tradition of arms. Local lore in Columbia, Tennessee says that in 1946, armed Negroes were a break, B-R-A-K-E, or a stop, on plans to lynch Thurgood Marshall. The prodigiously armed T.R.M. Howard and the surrounding black community were central in the quest for justice for Emmett Till. In 1956, Constance Baker Motley and Thurgood Marshall were guarded by armed black men overnight and on the way to the courthouse when they were in Birmingham, Alabama to press desegregation charges. Rosa Parks recounts vividly a table filled with guns as she and Raymond Parks, her husband, started hosting activist meetings at their house on Huffman Street, H-U-F-F-M-A-N, Huffman Street. And Raymond's gun, her husband, was a comfort when harassment began. Legendary activist Fred Shuttlesworth rode to the rescue with this is Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth. Legendary activist Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth in Birmingham, Alabama, rode to the rescue with a 15-car caravan of armed black men when freedom riders were menaced by a crowd in Anniston. Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, a good friend, Reverend Ed Gardner, would later capture the dichotomy that undergirded the movement, the civil rights movement, and equip about his nonviolent Winchester. Condoleezza Rice was just a child at the time, but she vividly reconstructs the scene of her father and the men of Dynamite Hill in Birmingham, Alabama, organizing an armed watch to deter bomb throwers. And they were bombing so many houses and businesses, things like this. White people were bombing so many in Birmingham, Alabama, that African Americans called Birmingham Bombingham, Alabama. And this is where the 16th Street Baptist Church was, September 13th, 1963. It was bombed. It was bombed about 3 weeks after the March on Washington, which was August 28th, 1963. Daisy Bates, who shepherded the Little Rock Nine through the integration struggle, offers a rich record of the culture of arms. Correspondence with Thurgood Marshall confirms that Daisy Bates kept Old Betsy at the ready. That's a gun. That's her gun. That's what she called her gun. Her memoir shows that she often carried a gun and once actually fired on a seething little man who had launched a firebomb at her home. We know Ida B. Wells advocated for every Negro needs to have a Winchester in their home. The African American home, a Negro home, is a coveted place for a Winchester. There's a deep, rich history of this. Okay, not African Americans being vigilantes, but having enough sense to protect ourselves from vigilantes. All right, look, we have to get out of here. Remember that at the African History Network, we focus on educating, empowering, and inspiring people of African descent throughout the diaspora and around the world, because right knowledge corrects wrong behavior. What you do for yourself, what you do to yourself, And what you allow other people to do to you and get away with is based upon what you think about yourself. What you think about yourself is based upon what you have been taught about yourself. What you've been taught about yourself is based upon everything you've read, heard, and seen about yourself. Remember, right knowledge corrects wrong behavior. It's not over till we win Wakanda forever. We'll talk to you next time. Peace.